This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Hi, everyone. This is Brianna Whitney, host of the True Crime Arizona podcast, and this is our second update from the Zombie Hunter trial. And I'm here with my colleague, Chief Investigative Reporter Morgan Lowe.
Hi there.
We have a lot to talk about after the first week of testimony in the trial of Bryan Patrick Miller. We've heard from about a half a dozen witnesses, including Angela Brosso's boyfriend from the time she was murdered, and we also heard from Melanie Bernas' mother.
This trial is moving quickly. It's a bench trial, so no jury, just the judge, Suzanne Cohen. And what that means is that they jumped right into opening statements first thing on the first day. And both sides offered pretty concise arguments on why the judge should see things their way. In fact, opening statements were finished in about an hour and a half that first day.
So let's start with opening statements. Here's a clip from the prosecutor, Vince Imbordino, wrapping up his argument that Bryan Patrick Miller is guilty of murder.
Two young women murdered in the prime of their life, according to a plan put in place by this defendant. As I said earlier, if this was a fantasy, it became a reality. And he carried it out. He murdered these two young women. He sexually assaulted these two young women. And we expect the evidence to show that he is guilty beyond reasonable doubt.
So he's facing 2 first-degree murder charges with Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas. And the prosecution is trying to show that DNA and everything really wraps this up with a bow, that these are what he's facing. He did these, no doubt, and that he's responsible for the murders of these 2 girls.
Yeah, and one of the things that he brought up during openings was this idea of the plan. And what they're referring to when they say the plan, it was this document that Bryan Patrick Miller wrote when he was a teenager. And his mother found it in his room. And what it did is it talked about this scenario where he would kidnap a 17-year-old girl, torture her, assault her, and then murder her. And prosecutors are now using that plan that was written years before the murders as the plan to commit these murders. So premeditated first-degree murder. He put the plan and he wrote the plan, came up with the plan, and then put it into place is what they are arguing. It's a key part of their case to show that this wasn't just something that happened at the last minute. This was something he had been thinking about. This all goes to the potential for the death penalty later in the case. And then the other thing is what the opening sort of showed us was the prosecution strategy. They are going to come up, show the evidence that Bryan Miller came up with this plan, he put the plan into place, and then the second part of that is that he tried to cover up the crimes. Because as we're going to hear, that would go to sort of contradict what the defense strategy is going to be, which is that he didn't realize what he was doing was wrong. But we'll get to that in just a minute here. Now, the defense team won't start their case for a couple of weeks, but we did get a sort of sneak peek at what their strategy is going to be. We knew they were heading in this direction, but hearing it in the courtroom made it real. And it was still surprising. Here is defense attorney Denise Dees.
The testimony will establish that at the time of these offenses, Bryan was suffering from autism spectrum disorder and complex dissociative disorders. And because of those mental diseases, Bryan did not know the nature or quality of his actions. For that reason, at the end of this trial, we'll ask you to find Bryan not guilty for these offenses by reason of insanity.
Now, part of the reason his defense team is claiming he was insane goes to several different factors, but one of which they focused on was saying that he had autism combined with dissociative disorders that deemed him insane at the time of these crimes. And that's really the defense's main point in saying he didn't know what he was doing was wrong. But they also point to abuse from his mother at a young age. And that's something that you and I read about in police documents and police reports. that he struggled with that abuse from his mom, who was also in law enforcement, correct?
Yeah, she was a detention officer, and they indicated in the openings that the judge and the people in the courtroom are going to hear from people who knew Bryan Miller at the time, and that they are going to talk about some of this alleged abuse that he suffered at the hands of his mother. They gave a couple of examples in the openings, and one of them was that she would watch extremely sexually explicit and violent movies in front of him when he was a young child. They went into some other examples, and we're really going to get into this as the trial goes on. But what they're trying to do is establish that at the time these murders took place, that he was unable to appreciate the nature and quality of his actions. That's the phrase that the defense attorney made. What they're trying to say is that he didn't understand what he was doing was wrong. And that is going to be a key point in this trial.
And that goes to this insanity defense that his team has come up with. I mean, we've said it on the news all this week, but they've all but conceded to the fact that he did commit these crimes, but that he was insane at the time. So what does that mean for the outcome of this trial? What could this mean if they're saying he did it, but he was insane?
Yeah, and that was really sort of the jaw dropper here. The phrase that she said was, he did not understand the nature and quality, which I talked about before, but she said, of his actions. And that was key, because at that point in the openings, they're conceding that these were his actions.
And no one else's.
Right. So he did it. They're saying he did it. However, he should not be held guilty because of this. So what does that do? I mean, the prosecution still needs to prove that murders took place and that he was the murderer, but the defense isn't going to attack that evidence. What they're going to focus on is that it's not his fault. This guy right here, it's not his fault here today. It was somebody else back then. Might have been the same person, but it's not the same person now. Really interesting stuff.
And not something we always see in a trial like this. A lot of times when it's a high-profile murder case or a death penalty case, we're seeing them going after not guilty. So I haven't experienced something like this before, and I think just watching this unfold and watching the defense present their evidence to try to argue that point is fascinating in just seeing how they go about their argument. It's just different.
Yeah, exactly. After opening statements, prosecutors moved straight into witness testimony. Most of the witnesses were police detectives. We also heard from the medical examiner. What prosecutors were doing were establishing for the judge that, one, these two women were murdered, and two, that the murders were committed in a manner that was most heinous.
And the testimony was clinical, but it was so graphic. They introduced crime scene photos and autopsy photos. Now, none of these were visible to the gallery where we are and the other members of the public were sitting. Only the attorneys and the judge could see them. But these injuries are hard to talk about. It was hard to even listen to the way that they're described. And in the courtroom, we've noticed there's not a whole lot of emotion being portrayed. So when we say the word clinical, it's very matter of fact. These are what the injuries were. But anybody like you and me are listening to these injuries, and it's almost unfathomable that somebody could have committed this brutal of an act, because the injuries that happened went well beyond after these girls died.
Yeah, so this is going to be a little part of this where it's going to get a little graphic, because we're going to detail what happened to them. So if you have a queasy stomach, you can fast forward about 2 minutes or just turn it down for 2 minutes. But this is the case that was laid out. Angela Brosso was on her bike. Her body showed evidence that she either fell off the bike or there was a struggle on the ground. There were abrasions on her legs. She has a knife wound, a stab wound on the left side of her back. And this was either a knife or a sharp object that penetrated her rib cage, broke one of her ribs, penetrated her lung, and then into the aorta on her heart. And the medical examiner testified that that was what killed her. That is not where the killer ended, because he, at that point, cut her on several different parts and he decapitated her. Cut her torso, decapitated her, and really mutilated her body.
And her head was found floating in the canal 10 days later. Just to imagine that coming across her head, it's awful. And so this is a death penalty case. So prosecutors are not only establishing that the victims were murdered, but that they were murdered in such an awful way. And we're going to play a couple clips from Detective Mike Meislish, who spent a lot of time on the stand over 3 days. We're going to start with the injuries that he saw on Angela's body at the scene.
There were some signs of incisions around the stump of her neck. She had an incision that went from roughly the top portion of her chest down to above her pubic bone area. There's another incision that went circumferentially around from the front to the sides to the back, all the way around her body. There were stab wounds in parts of her chest where the skin had been pulled back. And there are also some stab wounds onto, I believe it was her left breast. There are abrasions on her buttocks, her left thigh, part of her left leg. And a stab wound in her left center portion of her back.
We're going to play another soundbite from Detective Meislish here, where he answers questions about a symbol that was carved into Melanie Bernas's chest.
At least at that point in time, are you making note of what had been carved into her chest?
I was.
So when you're looking at it, what did it appear to be to you? For example, what is this?
It appears to be a cross. It's got a line that goes down between her breast and a smaller line that goes horizontal to that. To me, it looked like it was to basically picture a cross. Above her breasts are 3 letters, which are the letters WSC.
So it goes without saying that these crimes, these injuries were so heinous. Even just listening to that testimony, I had to replay it a few times to really understand and picture each injury that he was listing or talking about. And it leaves no human on the ground. I mean, it just is awful. And so there was a little bit of a difference between Angela's injuries and Melanie's, though there was a lot of overlap and similarities. What did you notice as being different learning about Melanie Bernas's murder?
Yeah. So the similarities, the kill wound was pretty much exactly the same, that one stab wound to the back. Investigators also found evidence that both women had been sexually assaulted post-mortem, which is definitely something that needs to be pointed out there. But there are some differences, as you said. Angela Brosso was decapitated. Melanie Bernas was not. Angela Brosso's body was really cut up pretty badly. Melanie's was not. She had a couple of cuts, but what Detective Meislish was talking about there was a cross carved into her chest and then some letters that said WSC. And on the stand, Detective Meislish said that they spent a lot of time trying to figure out what those initials stood for, and they couldn't come to any conclusion. At that time, there was a West Side Crips gang, and there is some thought that maybe the killer had done that to try to throw police off the trail. Possibly, that's speculation. But they were able to connect the two bodies because of the DNA there, and also that the kill wound was very unique, and I think we're going to hear a lot more of that as this trial goes on.
And does some of that go to the fact that it was done so well that these girls died so quickly? I mean, they did spend a fair amount of time, at least the medical examiner and Detective Meislish, talking about how quickly these girls died. Obviously, a lot of those wounds coming after that, but you and I have talked about it. They thought that the killer had a lot of technique, a lot of experience, knew what he was doing with a knife, possibly special ops, possibly a surgeon, possibly somebody who had experience with a knife. what do you anticipate is going to come from that in the trial in terms of that stab wound because of those factors?
Yeah, it's hard to tell because this is a bench trial and it's just the judge and no jury. There's really been no emotion. I mean, it is just, as we've said the word clinical over and over again. It's just, these are the facts. And so some of the facts that I would have thought would have been more interesting for a jury to hear or to play into a juror's emotions a little more are completely absent from this. So I don't know if they're going to bring in the idea that they were looking for somebody who had some kind of technique. I mean, nothing that I've read has attributed any special technique with a knife to Bryan Patrick Miller. So I'm imagining that that's not going to be something that's brought up in this case. They've sort of glossed over it last week with the medical examiner and the detectives. It's just something that stood out to me sitting in the courtroom because we've talked about this. We've looked at the police reports. This has been a big deal to us, but we're looking at it from the point of view of journalists and not necessarily lawyers or jurors or a judge.
And to that point, too, there's been some things where they start talking about something and I expect them to go well into detail on that or maybe even bring up the emotional side, and it's just not there. I know we talked about the plan and there was some conversation between attorneys during the testimony of that, what's admissible and what's not. There's been some discussion about if it could be presented in court. Does that change because there isn't a jury here and just a judge? And does that change some of the evidence, like the plan, that maybe would have been talked about further?
Yeah, so what I have noticed is fewer objections than I would expect to see in a jury trial. The judge is right there, so fewer objections. There have been some objections. They did introduce the plan, but it was interesting. The prosecutors talk about the plan as evidence of premeditation. The one time that the defense attorney referenced the plan, she said, a work of fiction by
fake.
Bryan Miller. Yes, it was him living out a fantasy or putting a fantasy on paper, but she called it a work of fiction. They call it evidence of premeditation.
So they're using it completely differently for their arguments.
Yeah, and we're going to see that. And if there was a jury there probably would have been a lot more argument about the way that piece of paper could be presented.
Because they would have been trying to sway the minds of the jury.
Right.
And there were a couple of witnesses that really brought it home that these were two young human beings, two young girls who were murdered, and that murder or those murders affected a whole lot of people in this community. One of those witnesses was Joseph Krakowiecki. He was Angela Brosso's boyfriend at the time, and he described the last day she was alive. It was the day before her 22nd birthday. She was going on an early evening bike ride, as she often did, and he stayed home this time to bake her a birthday cake. And they were planning to do their normal Sunday evening routine, which included watching the TV show In Living Color at 8 p.m. But that's when Angela didn't return home from her bike ride. Here's one of the prosecutors asking Joseph about what happened next.
When it became time to watch In Living Color, what was your headspace?
Where is she?
Objection, Your Honor, relevance.
I was just concerned where she was.
Did you do anything with that concern?
Yes, I did go out and ran the trail or rode the trail looking to see if she was out there and had issues with her bike or something like that where she may have needed help getting back to the apartment.
One of the things that stood out to me, first of all, sitting in the courtroom and listening to this testimony, was there wasn't a lot of emotion. And we've talked about how it's different with a judge as opposed to a jury. These have just been the facts. Joseph Krakowiecki was very well-spoken. He was very collected, very likable on the stand. And what I was looking for was any eye contact maybe that he would make with Bryan Miller, the man is accused of, and they've sort of admitted in court that he killed his girlfriend, did not make any eye contact over there. It was a lot less climactic than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah. Just listening to that too, he was very well spoken, and I feel like he laid out the timeline of Angela's last day very well. But in terms of people maybe thinking that there's going to be a lot of tears on the stand, things like that, he definitely didn't go that direction at all. He answered the questions well. He seemed like a nice guy who definitely cared about Angela. I think the most emotional part I heard from him was when he said, was trying to recall something about that day, and he was like, hey, God, it was so many years ago, but it stuck with me that many years.
Yeah, he used that phrase, and he also referred to her as Angie. I mean, all these years, Angela Brosso. Mm-hmm. She was Angie. She wasn't Angela. It really brought it home. I'll tell you, though, the testimony that was probably the toughest to listen to was from Melanie Bernas's mother. And I say the toughest to listen to because it's impossible to imagine the pain that this woman has gone through. And you could hear a little bit of that pain in her voice. She did not appear in person. She called in and testified via a phone line or some kind of an internet portal. But here's a clip where the prosecutor asks her about the last time she saw her daughter, Melanie.
The night that Melanie went missing, when was the last time that you saw her that day?
I saw her I left the house to go out to dinner at about 7:10.
And what was she doing?
When I left her, she was sitting on the sofa in the family room because she had not gone to school that day. When I said goodbye to her, I kissed her, said, I love you, and she was sitting on the sofa, and I said, I'll see you in a little while.
One of the other parts of her testimony that sort of caught me is she described what her mood was that night when her daughter didn't come home, and she used the word frantic. She was frantic, as you would imagine a mother would be when a daughter who was not used to staying out all night, this was not the kind of girl that would go out at night without telling her mom, does not come home.
And I think, too, something that sticks out is just even knowing about missing persons cases now, there's a lot of cell phone tracking, social media, trying to track their whereabouts that way. You have to remember this was in 1992 and 1993. None of that existed. So they're relying on their daughter's word of mouth or girlfriend, in Joe's case, that they were coming home at a certain time. And when they didn't, there's no tracking a cell phone. There's no looking for Ring doorbell surveillance cameras or things like that that would maybe or definitely exist today. It was just boots on the ground. We've got to find these girls, and terrifying when you don't have any clues as to where they are.
Yeah, and Marlene Bernas lived at home alone with Melanie. They had other kids that had grown up and left the house. The father was not living there. And she said that she called her friend, she called her daughter's friend, she called her ex-husband to see if he knew, and then she started calling hospitals. Ugh. Because that's what you did back then. She called hospitals to find out if a teenager had been in a bicycle crash. She noticed the bicycle was gone, and no answer, no answer, no answer. I can't imagine the amount of despair that she had. She was also very well-spoken, very well collected. You could tell that she was elderly because of her voice. I'm assuming if Melanie was 17 and she was the youngest of the kids, that maybe Marlene Bernas was in her 40s or early 50s at that time. And so she's in her 70s or late 70s or 80s now. And for her to have to testify to what it felt like back then, I can't imagine the toll that took on her. Her testimony lasted about 20 minutes. It was very short.
Wow, that is short. And I think, too, when we talk about these people that were involved in their lives being well-spoken, you have to imagine they may have been waiting 30 years for this moment to be able to talk about what happened in a setting like this. It's their day in court to really talk about this. So I think it's interesting. They haven't done a lot of media interviews over these years. We've talked about the case. The case has been in the public spotlight to an extent, but these families, these people who knew these victims so personally, they haven't really talked about it. This is really the first time we're hearing them. And so I imagine it's been a lot of tumultuous time in their mind, just trying to collect their thoughts to get to this point, to tell the judge about those days. And I can't imagine how hard it is, but I also wonder if it's some weight off their shoulders, maybe helping with some closure that they're finally at this point and they're finally sharing parts of their story.
30 years. I can't imagine what it would feel like after the testimony. Now, they testified for the prosecution there. There's a chance that they'll be called back, but they likely will be called back in the penalty phase of this, assuming that he's found guilty and assuming the penalty phase follows. They would probably be called on to testify in the victim impact statements. That's where I would imagine we're going to get the emotion. This is what you did to my family. That kind of sort of feeling in the trial. So we probably will hear from both of those parties again.
And that penalty phase is when they would decide whether he's going to be put to death or spend life in prison or X amount of years in prison, right?
So this is a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but I'm assuming the first phase of the trial, it's going to be either guilty or not guilty by reason of insanity. Assuming it's guilty at that point, it's going to be what's the penalty, as you said. Could be death, that's what the prosecutors are asking for. Could be life in prison or however many years. Totally up to the judge here because the jury is out and the defense acquiesced to that. The defense asked for it just to be a bench trial.
So if it's not guilty by reason of insanity, then what are we looking at in that case?
A mental institution, and then every 6 months or year or so, a reevaluation of whether he's still legally insane, whether he is a threat to society, and potentially down the road a possibility of him getting out. I mean, that is what happens when you are not guilty by reason of insanity.
And it's such a span when we're talking about the outcomes of that. I mean, think about that. We're just talking about he might be put to death, or he could walk free in 6 months, a year, years down the road if he's not guilty by reason of insanity. That is a huge spectrum of what could happen in this case, and we just don't know how this is all going to play out in the end.
Yeah.
Wow. So what's coming up next week, or this upcoming week, I guess?
Yeah.
We had this first week, it was big. We had opening statements. We learned about the crimes, the injuries, and some of the family members. But what do you think will be a focus of this second week of trial?
Yeah. So I think we're only going to have 2 days of testimony this week. Then they're going to take a break. But in those 2 days, I think the prosecutors are going to continue to make their case. This week, they established that the murders took place. These were the victims. These were the circumstances of the murders. And I think this coming week, they're going to establish what led them to Bryan Patrick Miller and give details about how and why he was arrested and their case that it was him. Because we heard that in the openings, but we didn't hear any evidence yet that it's him. So I think this week is when we're going to start to hear that part of the case.
And that in and of itself could be making history because it was genetic genealogy that started that path to Bryan Patrick Miller. And that's going to be fascinating to listen to in court as well. That's it for this episode of True Crime Arizona, the Zombie Hunter trial. We'll be back next week with more developments in this case as the trial continues. True Crime Arizona, the podcast, is hosted by me, Brianna Whitney.
And me, Morgan Lowe. It is a production of 3TV, CBS 5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.